All right, let's welcome in Paul Lukas from ESPN and Uni Watch to talk about this new uniform reveal. Quotations around the new, though. Some fans were upset that the release didn't live up to the hype. Paul, have you seen that generally happening around the league as they introduce these new Nike uniforms?
Yeah, I think there's often a misconception among fans that when a league changes uniform outfitters, as is the case here with the NBA changing from Adidas to Nike, a lot of fans think that that means every team is going to get a redesign, and it doesn't work that way. If you go back to 2012 when the NFL switched from Reebok to Nike, or even just a month or so ago, the NHL switched from Reebok to Adidas. It's kind of musical chairs with these companies and the various sports and leagues. But when you look at those other examples, again, you see the same thing. Most teams stick with what they had or make extremely minor changes. And that's not really so surprising. If you look around the league, not necessarily in Charlotte, but you look at teams like the Kings or the Jazz, they just unveiled new uniforms a year or two ago, within very recent time frames. So you don't expect them to suddenly give themselves another makeover when they just gave themselves a makeover. And I think fans sometimes misunderstand how this works. And as you say, there's a lot of hype, and people expect that every change is going to be a momentous or radical change. And a lot of times it's a very small change. And of course, that's what we saw with the Hornets.
Yeah, I think the hype part is weird, right, Paul? Because teams are approaching this differently. I mean, the Bulls, they just rolled out theirs via social media, I guess, basically. The Hornets, asked people to get on the app, enable push notifications, be ready for a big launch. And then, through the clouds, the two players appear in basically the same exact uniform. So I don't
Right.
I don't know if I'm not sure if there's, necessary blame to go around, but it does seem a little misleading, especially from the team standpoint. And I guess the league has kind of left it up to the teams to roll these things out, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of unusual. Usually, when there's a change in outfitters, when there's the whole uniform contract for a league transitions from one company to another, usually there's one big unveiling event, and that's what the NHL just did in Las Vegas for their changeover. It's what the NFL did right here in Brooklyn, where I'm speaking to you from in 2012, and I was at that event, and it was very similar to what you're describing. They had live players on hand, and they sort of emerged from a cloud of smoke or dry ice or whatever, and everybody went ooh and ah, and then everybody realized that almost all the teams looked exactly the same as they had looked the year before. So there is this sense of anticlimax, but it is, yes, as you say, it is unusual that the NBA seems to be letting the teams kind of do it, on a team by team basis, however they want, and with not much advance notice. Like I do this for a living. I write about this beat for a living, and I did not know the Bulls were going to do that unveiling today. Of course, they didn't change very much. Some teams have given a little more advance notice, and as you say, some are doing it via social media. Some have done it with live events. And the Hornets seem to do it mainly as a way of getting people to download their app, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're saying, and that's kind of what I've been hearing as well. And so, I guess some fans were not happy that after all of that they basically got the same design they already had with some very minor changes.
Right, of course. And I mean, I think the main thing they were really pushing and the big focus for them was the addition of the Jumpman logo, which of course is the only U.S. Pro sports team. Everybody else in the NBA is wearing Nike. I mean, how big of a deal is that, Paul, that this, Michael Jordan's logo, the Jumpman logo, is on there? I mean, does that warrant kind of the hype that they were putting out there?
If you care about a certain kind of corporate theater, I guess it could matter to you. It's worth noting that up until this coming season, the NBA or NBA uniforms have never had a maker's mark. There's never, if you look at the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NHL, their uniforms for many years now have carried the manufacturer's logo. The NFL, they have the Nike swoosh on the sleeves. The NHL has had Reebok, and now will have Adidas on the back of the collar. And Major League Baseball has the Majestic mark on the sleeve. But the NBA has never had that because David Stern always believed that the team brands were more important than any manufacturer's brand. And Nike, as part of their contract, negotiated that they wanted their logos to appear on all the uniforms. And of course, David Stern is no longer the commissioner. Adam Silver is now. And so, yeah, everyone else is going to have the Nike logo. The Hornets will have the Jordan logo. I mean, to me, like it's the same thing. Like it's the same corporate structure. I mean, if that matters to somebody, I guess good for them. I guess it does make more sense to see the Jordan logo on a basketball uniform than say on the University of Michigan's football uniform, where it's always, I guess the last season they started that, it's sort of weird to see a basketball icon on a football jersey. Right. So it makes a little more sense. And I mean, if the Hornets want to claim that this is sort of some sort of exclusivity, I guess they can claim it. It is essentially the same uniform. It's the same materials. It's the same cut. But as I say,
as everyone else, right?
As everybody else is getting. It's not like it's a higher grade of anything. But if you, as I mentioned, if you care about a certain kind of corporate theater or branding, scorekeeping and exclusivity, then I guess it matters. I can't say I'm one of those people, but I know there are such people out there.
Yeah, I have to admit, I probably am one of those people. But even to me, I mean, I knew what it was going to look like, right? So there wasn't that much mystery to the reveal. It's interesting. I think Jordan Brand will also be revealing some new North Carolina football uniforms. You mentioned the Michigan uniforms. I think they're having their reveal. I think it's this weekend. They'll have the Jumpman on there too. Right.
So, I mean, to me, it's always a little weird to have that basketball icon, on a non-basketball uniform.
Right.
But if that's what Nike and Jordan want to do, and if that's what their clients want to do, that's up to them.
And another thing about that, Paul, that I found interesting on release day, the Hornets talked a little bit about the corporate sponsor, patch that some of the teams are putting in, and they spoke about it from a standpoint of not necessarily meshing with the team, but meshing with that Jumpman brand, which I thought was kind of interesting. They don't want something on the other side of that that's not going to pair well with the Jumpman logo.
Yeah, I think that's sort of an interesting aspect of the uniform advertising patch program that's starting this year. Since the Nike, or in the Hornets case, Jumpman logo, since those logos are being added to uniforms this year. I mean, so that's like a branding presence that's being added to the uniforms. But then you also have teams that are adding these corporate advertising patches. Right. And there's sort of a competition that, I think if you are an advertiser and you're thinking about buying space on a team's jersey, which personally, for what it's worth, I find very distasteful, and I wish no team was doing it, but it is happening. Well, wouldn't you rather have done that in the previous era, the David Stern era, when there was no competing brand on, just a few inches away. And now you've got this very strong logo, the Nike logo, or in the case of the Hornets, the Jordan logo, that's sharing space with you. And you're sort of competing for the viewer's eyeballs and the viewer's attention and hearts and minds and all that kind of stuff. So it's weird. I find it a little weird that these two things are happening at the same time, that in the same season, the manufacturer's logo is being added. And for, 11 teams now, I think, the advertiser's patch is also being added, because those things, I think, could arguably be seen as being at cross purposes.
Yeah, so that's kind of weird from that standpoint, because the teams are controlling that corporate patch, right? And so the Hornets would seem to be the only team. And through Jordan Brand, I guess, they can basically say all the focus is on this logo, whereas Nike obviously has their logo and everything else, and they're bringing in another corporate sponsorship patch. Yeah, it's kind of a weird crossover there.
Yeah, and of course, as of now, and it's still, it's more than 2 months before the start of the season, about 2.5 months. But as of now, only about a third of I think it's 11 teams total, have announced advertising partners. Out of the 30 teams in the league. And I think most observers, myself included, are a little surprised that it's such a small number. I think there was an expectation that it would be every team. And that hasn't happened. It may still end up happening, and we should say here for people who don't know, it's not mandatory. Teams are not required to have an advertising patch on their jerseys. But I think there was an expectation that teams would strike deals quickly and take the money, and that they'd have advertisers kind of beating down the door and competing with each other, and there'd be a bidding war and blah, blah, blah. And that clearly hasn't happened because you've got like 2/3 of the league almost have not yet announced something. Now that could change, and I think it will change. I think we will see more of these announcements in the lead up to the season, and we may even see some during the season. There's nothing to say that you can't add an advertising partner in the middle of the year. But I do think it's gotten off to a slower start than most observers expected.
Here with Paul Lukas from ESPN and Uni Watch. He is a sports uniform expert. Paul, they still have confirmed 2 more jerseys or 2 more uniform sets to unveil, and there's rumors that the Hornets could be one of 8 teams that get the classic set. So there could be maybe possibly a return to those pinstripe uniforms that were so iconic for the Charlotte Hornets. What are your thoughts on those uniforms? And let me add this, because this is a little controversial on our show. I'm a big fan of 90s jerseys, NBA jerseys, because I feel like they're a time capsule, because they were sort of a one-off for a lot of teams, whereas my cohorts, they like timeless uniforms. What are your thoughts on the Hornets and 90s jerseys in general?
First, as you mentioned, the Hornets will get 2 more alternate uniforms released at some point. We don't know when, and it's really not clear if it will be before the start of the season, or I think it's probably going to be after the start of the season. But that's not
Paul,
clear.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. They said the other day that they're going to release these other 2 before the end of the summer, I believe. Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in some of their talks on social media earlier this week, they said before the end of the summer for the Hornets.
All right, I was not aware of that. So thanks for setting me straight on that. But no, seriously. But every team is going to have at least those 2 additional uniforms, and it remains to be seen what those are. And then, as you mentioned, 8 teams are going to get. They're calling it classic. Let's just say they're throwbacks, because that's what they are. And I think, while I do not know this for a fact, I would be stunned if the Hornets were not one of those 8 teams. I am fairly certain that's going to be the case. And of course, you're referring to the original Hornets uniform worn by the original Hornets franchise, and that's the uniform that was designed by a menswear designer, Alexander Julian. And that design, that pair of uniforms, the home and the road, really set the tone throughout the sports world with its use of purple and teal. For the next dozen years or so, so many teams in so many different sports that either came into existence, like new expansion teams, or that gave themselves a redesign, existing teams that went through a redesign, they all used purple and or teal. And I've written about this a lot. And you look at Major League Baseball, the Colorado Rockies and the Arizona Diamondbacks and the Florida Marlins, those are all 90s teams that wore purple or teal or both. You look at hockey, and you had the San Jose Sharks, and you look at other NBA teams, the Raptors and the Grizzlies came into existence wearing teal and purple. And and that all started this whole trend. What did I leave out? I left out the NFL with the Baltimore Ravens wearing purple, and the
Panthers,
Jaguars, Panthers, Jaguars. All different shades of teal is sort of a flexible color, or its definition is a little flexible. Some people might say that some of those colors are more turquoise or whatever, but clearly you can track all those colors back to that first Hornets uniform set. I think some people would say, for better or for worse, but it was definitely a very strong trend throughout the sports design world. And as far as being a classicist versus like a 90s guy, I think there's room for both. I think you've got teams like the Knicks and the Celtics and the Bulls who you wouldn't really want to change their main identity.
Yeah.
These are legacy teams with deep, proud heritages. They've got deep, long investments in a certain look, and they've got fans that go back multiple generations. You've got, parents and their kids rooting for the same uniform, basically, largely unchanged. And then you've got newer teams that don't have as deep a history, and who came into existence at a more freewheeling time, and experimented more and don't have that same kind of long-standing connection, and I think that's fine too. I think the sports world and the universe, as I like to call it, are big enough to handle both approaches to design. I think you can have your Celtics and you can have I don't know, your 1990s 76ers and Suns and all those teams that were really going a little crazy there in the 90s.
Yeah, no, we've told Doug, stuff like some of the Hawks uniforms, and he's for some reason he's a big fan of the Pistons, which of those teams you mentioned, they took on teal, like they redid their whole thing. They had teal. The Spurs had like teal, kind of accenting some of their logos around that time too. Yeah, that is crazy. I wanted to ask you one question about those classic uniforms. You know, when the Hornets rebranded, there was talk that they would wear those sometime in the future. And I remember seeing some things being written that basically they couldn't wear those full time because those were now under the flagship of like the Hardwood Classics collection. Are you familiar with any of that?
I heard those same things. I never really got a straight answer out of anybody. It's that kind of corporate machinations is nobody really likes to talk about that because nobody wants to tell fans that, well, the team can't wear this because of some sort of licensing, blah blah blah. Right. But I have heard those things. I don't know how true it is or what it does seem odd, right, that the Hornets wouldn't have worn that throwback, which I know is very popular with fans. Right. They reclaimed their color scheme. It seems surprising that they hadn't yet or haven't yet reclaimed that original design. But I'll be very surprised if they don't reclaim it this season as part of the throwback program.
All right, Paul. Paul, thanks so much for spending this time with us and schooling us on a few things. We really appreciate it. Last question here before we get you out. Do you think with the Nike coming in and bringing in 4 different uniforms and sort of this radical new direction that they're taking NBA uniforms, do you think that they're moving in a right direction?
I think some things about it I'm kind of behind. Like I like the idea of saying you can wear any color either at home or on the road. I think in an era of high def color TV, you don't necessarily have to have one team wearing white. I don't think that means you should just get rid of white uniforms, and of course they're not. But I think you can have color versus white, but you can have color versus color, and in fact that's already been happening because teams have been allowed to wear color at home. I think up to 8 times a season. And so we've seen increasingly with all the special occasion uniforms, like the Christmas uniforms and things like that, we've been seeing a lot of color versus color games. And now we're clearly going to see more of them. And a lot of them look great. And so I'm fine with that. And I thought it was really interesting today that the Bulls, when they revealed their new uniforms, which are basically almost exactly the same as their old uniforms. But one thing they said is that their red uniform, which of course had been their road design, is now going to be their primary home design. And I don't think any other team has said that. It's been understood that under the new protocol, you can wear whatever you want at home. But I don't know that anyone else has declared the way the Bulls just declared today that they're going to wear, a primary color at home. And so that's pretty interesting to me. I also thought it was a little odd that they said, well, white will be our primary road uniform. There's no way for them to know that because that depends on what the other team is wearing if they're on the road, if the Bulls are on the road and the home team chooses to wear white, well, white will not be the Bulls' primary road uniform that day. Yeah. So because the home team gets to call the shot and the road team has to choose something that has enough contrast. So I thought it was a little odd that the Bulls made that declaration. They may not have thought through, the implications of how that's going to work out.
And Paul, the other thing I noticed with that was they're calling their association jersey, which is their white one, their road one, and I think the Hornets kind of referred to their association one as the home. Like I'm already done with these new monikers for home and road, Paul.
I'm just calling them white and red and whatever they are. I'm not like that because all those other terms are just marketing terms. It's not my job to do Nike's or the NBA's marketing for them. If it's a white uniform, I'm going to call it a white uniform. I'm a journalist. I describe things, as they are, and that's what they are.